Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Bursch. I'm the Senior Vice President of University Partnerships at Emeritus. It's great to have you here for what I think is a wildly important panel discussion around how we expand access to education. With me today are three leaders at world-class institutions. We're going to talk about what they have seen in this area and what they see most importantly for tomorrow in this area. So with me today, Wendy Colby, the Vice President and Associate Provost of BU Virtual at Boston University. Jennifer Howell, Pro-Vice Chancellor of Global Engagement at the University of Western Australia. And Peter Zemsky, the Eli Lilly Chaired Professor of Strategy and Innovation at INSEAD. So let's just jump right in. And as we think about how we want to expand access, I always like to think of the context of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Where we've been has always been about study abroad. Still an important piece for students, but I want to really jump into kind of where we are today about online. And online has always been, in theory, this great way to create access. It has done a lot for us, but where we are today at online, the good, the bad, the ugly a bit, I would love to get the panel's perspective on the future of online education in terms of access. So Peter, let's start with you and some thoughts on what we've done with online education and where you see it going.
Great. Clearly, one of the big successes in EdTech, in us expanding access, leveraging technology, full stop. For INSEAD, obviously business school, hugely important element of corporate education. So I think for us, fundamentally has allowed us to go much deeper in companies, serve global populations, and really build that capability. So that's like been a flat out win. We had been super excited in COVID about the complement between recorded online and live virtual. We thought that was an even more powerful combo, but to some extent have had to pull back on the live virtual just because, you know, in people's daily life, there's so many Teams calls, so many Zoom calls, they get saturated and the motivation's not there. We still work on it. We're not going to give up on that, but that's been a little bit of a setback more recently.
Rigor is important in the conversation. Wendy, thinking about how do we maintain rigorous standards? How do we make sure that what we're doing online is not just equal to, but above what we maybe would see in a classroom?
Yeah, sure. So just to pick up on what Peter was sharing as well, so at Boston University, like a lot of universities, we've been in the world of online for a number of years. We have over 30 online programs, many of them emanated out of professional and continuing education colleges. More recently, we developed what I like to call a new business model in online education, as you know, Dan, which was really a focus on what we call our online at scale portfolio. And this was a way, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it was really a way to start to look at how we open up access to new segments of learners at a lower price point. So in our case, we offered an online MBA, soon to be followed by a Master of Public Health and a Master in Data Science, all online, graduate level, offered at a $25,000 price point. When you talk about rigor and the approach we take to pedagogy and curriculum development, we really had to think about a new business model to do that at scale. And so that meant that we were really rethinking everything, rethinking how we deploy faculty and still do that in a way, right, that they can touch the students and be very much a part of that program. How do we think about the synchronous versus asynchronous and really building community and collaboration inside of the program? So it's a very rich cohort experience, very team-based. That meant we had to leverage new technologies and new tools to really enable that new experience. That also meant we had to think about marketing and enrollment in different ways. And so it's really a whole new ecosystem in terms of how we've had to think about online at scale, and that really has driven tremendous results for us.
I love that. And as we think of the theme about beyond borders, Jennifer, the work the University of Western Australia has done with partnerships and creating access to new parts of the world, how did you think to come up with this idea of, and pull off what you're doing here in India and other parts of the world for accessible education?
So Australia is sort of suffering from being the bottom of the world. We're a long way from everyone. We're a huge country with a small population. We don't play nicely with each other. We don't look to the right-hand side of our country to collaborate. And in Western Australia, we've always looked outwards. We've looked to the Indo-Pacific region And we've also really struggled with how do we reach our regional students. An awful lot of our population are not located in the capital cities. So this was always a burden. How do we do this in a meaningful way that it's not disengaging, a file dump, and how do we take those learnings and look outwards? And that's why we looked at partners like Emeritus. For us, it wasn't about replicating what we could do within Australia. We wanted to access a completely different group of students. We were very mindful that the majority of Southeast Asia had a very different price point. We knew this because they weren't coming to Australia to purchase our degrees. We'd priced ourselves completely out of the market, and we really need to challenge our business model. University of Western Australia is part of the group of 8, so we're part of the top tier universities in Australia. Our price point is not competitive. So it was really us thinking about how do we do this differently and how do we reach a different type of student, because every student should have that opportunity for a top 100 education, regardless of opportunity. And so that was sort of our thinking. Once you start thinking in that way and challenging yourselves, and I think the pandemic really did help all of us start challenging how we do things, we started looking for different ways, and that's now filtered into what we're doing with our Australia-based students. We're thinking of ways now, how do we globalise their experience? How do we put that little piece of global into their everyday program and get them moving out of Australia? Because Australian students traditionally only ever go to the US, the UK and Canada. And that shows a decided lack of being a global citizen, I think.
Just maybe one thing on this quality issue. So obviously sometimes with tech online, you work, like with the community, you work hard to get close to in person. But what I love is when there's things that go better with online. So one is like typically for us in person, there are these concentrated modules, wonderful, but that's not the best way to learn. So the ability to stretch the learning out with online, bring in action learning and applications was huge for us, especially once we started adding like live coaches to make that possible. So I think it's really important that we look for ways to make, you know, the technology thing even better than in person in some ways.
I love that. Peter, let's build off of that a bit further, right? So the idea that knowledge should be shared, knowledge should be accessible, technology plays a key role. And if we're going to expand the reach of INSEAD and UWA and BU, we have to use technology to do so. So could you touch on a bit the things you've seen that have worked, some of the things that have maybe not worked, and what do you see in the future?
Let me maybe focus on AI just to dive right into it. So again, it's a general purpose technology because you can look at almost any activity in education and you can think about applications. One thing that works is obviously generating content, whether it's lesson plans or scripts. However, when you think about the job to be done, we don't typically lack content, so that it's sometimes too easy. The other one, obviously, lots of talk about personal tutors. Clearly, that's effective. It's new. Again, super crowded. So, like when you think about certainly as a school, where do you want to add value? It's not clear. The one I think is challenging, but where we're starting to focus is around moving from sort of knowing to doing. So like online education is great for telling people what you should do. This is how you active listen. This is how you tell a story. There's a big difference between watching the video and doing it. So we're really interested, whether it's incorporating actual virtual analysts into our courses to help people with the applications, or the sort of conversational role plays. Those things I think are places where there's work to be done to do it well, and a university faculty working with ed techs could lead. That's sort of my point of view.
I love that. So as we think about the expansion and accessibility and how do we expand access to education, obviously accessibility from the affordability angle is wildly important with thinking about different economic impact around the world. Wendy, when BU Questrom School launched its online MBA in the US, was a wildly disruptive price point at $25,000 US. Talk about the reason behind that and then where BU can continue to push in this area.
Yeah, sure. And, picking up on something Jennifer said earlier, I think inside of large institutions like mine, you really do have to push on the business models, right? And so for us, as we were starting to think about how do we do business education in a new way, how do we really live up to our mission to reach more learners and identify new segments? And so we did take a very bold move at BU at the time. In fact, I know many of my counterparts said, "What have you done to this industry by offering a $25,000 online MBA?" And so I think we've now seen, of course, a lot of universities. There's over 800 online MBAs out there today. A lot of universities have started to move into this space. So what we have seen, which has been really interesting in terms of access, is many times you see online degrees that pull from the region. In our case, we're seeing just the opposite. Only about 15% of our students today are coming from New England. In fact, about 25% of our population are coming from international and then all over the US. And many of them, again, we targeted a new segment. When you talk about what's needed inside of a university, culture change, business change, new segments, at first there was a lot of concern about, am I going to cannibalize my other core business? What am I going to do today? Our residential, if you look at our residential MBA, which is 5 times the price point today, and a very exclusive program and targeted to a certain segment that remains a vital segment for us. But this is a working professional market now where the average age is 37. Our learners are coming from the top Fortune 1000 companies all over the globe. And so the peer-to-peer interaction has really been amazing. And we're seeing now 10x the number of students in our online programs as we see in our residential programs. And I think now what we've also seen is we're bringing, our faculty are seeing, right? We have faculty who never taught online before. And now they're seeing that importance of bringing BU to the world and the world to BU. And so I think it's a large reason why online and our unit has really become a catalyst for the university in terms of driving the kind of change that I think we need to continue to push forward inside our institutions.
If I can just add to that, the hardest piece in this journey was challenging the business model, because you were really tapping into academic identity and perceptions of value and worth. And let's face it, when you're doing an online program, it's a volume model. And I think the Academy is very uncomfortable about thinking commercially about the sacred knowledge they look after. And so it was really hard to lean into that space. It requires a lot of bravery, but I tell you what, once they start seeing the proof of the quality of the students, it's never about the money. There's always this anxiety about volume. You're going to have poorer quality students. The furthest from that is actually true, because the students who pick online learning are more motivated and more determined often than the ones who come and sit physically in our classrooms. They're juggling a whole lot of other life factors and they're really motivated to be in that program. So you're really challenging an awful lot of some of those norms that are sitting in people's heads.
Maybe I want to connect the dots between the work you're doing to scale and the technology side. So if you think there's disruption coming with AI and the technology side, these kind of disruptions typically have an important scale component. It's very hard to play and make the fixed investments for a program with 100 people. And so I think those schools that have scaled up in some ways are going to find they have more options or better able to play and innovate in what's coming.
Yeah, just to build on this too, and again, it may be my lens inside of a large university, like my counterparts up here today too, but I think we're seeing so much change in higher education today and a changing demographic and also at the graduate level. And I think this is what has helped shine a light with many of our deans and faculty is graduate residential populations in general are shifting, right? They're declining in most of our institutions. And so I think our deans and faculty are now realizing we have to think about new ways of doing business, right? So to your point, Jennifer, they have to think more strategically. What does my portfolio look like today? What should I take online versus on ground? Some programs will be large enrollment programs by virtue of the markets they're in. Others won't, but it will be more of a sustainment strategy for those. And I think that's what ultimately leads into different thinking about partnership, as you've done with Emeritus, and growing our footprint in different ways, right, to move even beyond that whole B2C approach.
Certainly, just to bring another interacting theme in here. So INSEAD, we work on global careers, free movement of people. You can argue globalization going forward or not, but definitely free movement of people is suffering. And so I mean, except for as a U.S. institution, maybe you'll have a new campus in Gaza, it turns out, but for the most part, the ability for people to travel, that was maybe a little uncalled for, but anyway, what's happening with globalization and the Trump administration in some ways also makes it more interesting, certainly for institutions like ours that are trying to build bridges, having online routes to do that, I think gets increasingly important.
I think one of the most exciting things about all of these globalizing endeavours is you're reaching countries you would never normally have reached. I've been lucky enough to work in the UK, US, Hong Kong. Each time I was there, I would have a completely different mix of students. And it used to be exciting to encounter your first student from Mongolia, for an example, if I was in the UK. I'm now habitually having conversations with countries I would never have thought I would be looking for partnerships with, or I would be teaching students in, or thinking about changing the trajectory of students living in these parts of the world. And an example, Azerbaijan was never on my radar, yet it's one of the most enthusiastic countries in our portfolio, constantly reaching out to partner. And I would never have thought in my career I would be talking with partners in Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. These are emerging markets, and they're really opened up because of online. That's pretty powerful, because then our academics can then be looking at doing research, and there's all these other things that sort of flow on. It's very exciting.
Well, let's build off that though, because this is a really important piece. As we think about expanding borders to education, there are a lot of cultural things to think about and how we teach. And while there's fundamental knowledge that is the core, who we teach to and how we want them to apply that knowledge is different. So as an example, if anyone's familiar with US graduate management education, all of the case studies that are used are about companies that make beer and companies that make cars. That may not be applicable in a global world. So, Jennifer, as you talk about, it's great to have these conversations. How do you convert that to applicable education beyond just the core knowledge in new countries?
Oh, we've been deep in the trench of decolonising our curriculum for a long time in Australia, and I can tell you with great joy, I had to pretty much put rules and regulations in to drag a lot of people with me. But it's small things such as have a look at your reading list. Are they all from the US and UK? Cull it out. Think about who your mix of students are. Have some articles and journal articles and case studies that are from a diverse mix of regions and populations. We had some terrible missteps in the Middle East. We had a lot of vulnerable staff. We had staff put in vulnerable positions because of the content of the programs we were teaching. So that was a sharp learning curve of tidying up your content and thinking about your context. Because you've really got to be mindful of the local students, the local regs, perhaps perceptions. There are all sorts of cultural layers. But that whole decolonising piece is really quite powerful, very confronting. But you need to go through that phase.
So as my analog mind tries to live in this digital space, Peter, on that same topic, technologies that we can use to help with this process of transferring knowledge by a culture, is this the place for AI?
So let me flip two sides. One is, again, I love what you're talking about, getting the faculty to know the local context. Again, for INSEAD, putting 40% of our faculty in Singapore helped a lot. And again, I think as much as I want to push the technology, that core about in-person programs where faculty interacts intensively with an audience is great in some ways for the R&D. Now, when we think about taking that precious knowledge and going global, clearly, AI has a translation ability that's amazing. Still not good enough, as we know, if it really needs to sound local, there's lots of language where it's not good enough, but it seems that's going to be solved in the years ahead. So clearly, again, if you want access, you got to move out of English or whatever, and that's a big limitation for my institution. But clearly, we're starting to see some parts of stuff where it's easy to do with AI, and I think that's going to help if we're patient.
Just building on that, right, I think the world of work is global, the world of education is global, and we try to be very intentional in terms of how we're setting up our programs. So there are global kind of examples, right, or cohorts that students would work on. Think climate change and how that is affecting regions around the world. And so I think you have to do that in very intentional ways, back to your point about not being so siloed, only having US exam, that doesn't work. So we have to be very cognizant of the world of work.
So as we think about what it takes to create a more globally focused educational institution, it requires two things that I'm comfortable saying in the education space have not historically been true. That institution has to be able to innovate and has to be able to really change. Because if one thing, especially in the higher ed space, that universities do well, is what they have always done. So as we think about that, and I want to start with you, Jennifer, because how do you push that? Because for every Arizona State University, there are 100 institutions that would just say, well, this is how we do it, and this is how we will always do it. What was effective at UWA to really change the mindset of what and where you want to go?
Two things I think really helped us. We had a new Vice Chancellor 4 years ago arrive, and he is an atypical Vice Chancellor for the University of Western Australia. He originally comes from Bangladesh, and he's a product of international education. That brought a strategic lens that was incredible change agent for our entire ecosystem. So suddenly our strategic vision was more global. We'd stop sort of sitting where we were, focusing on excellent research, everyone will come to us because we're wonderful, to let's look outwards and engage with the world we're a part of. I think the other bit is that we have a strong emphasis on mobility for our students. We are trying to get them to go out, if it's only for 6 weeks or 6 months or 12 months of their studies, and get out there and have an exchange and see the world and experience the world. And when I first arrived, we were sort of bubbling along at about 400 students a year would bravely go out and leave Australia, but they would bravely go to Ivy League in the US. That's hardly brave. Now we're getting closer to 1,200 a year, and they're from much more diverse countries. And they're coming back, they're telling their stories, and I'm seeing the numbers slowly climb. That's been a game changer, because that's changing the thinking and the perspectives of the cohort based in Australia. And that's really had a big impact on us. So when we start leaning into more global initiatives, the culture within the student body is much more prepared for us to innovate. And I think from the strategy at the top to the grassroots of the students going out, it's leading this momentum.
Okay, as we think about, we have a few minutes left, but as we wrap this, let's bring this back to the conference theme, All Eyes on India. And I'm going to put all of you on the spot a bit, as you're going to be representing your continents. And if we want to turn the cameras off, we might want to do that. But as we think about how we help to create more access here in India, as a North American, Australian, European institutions, what do you think the key is to change the thinking in your home campuses and your home environments to create a more accessible education to this country?
You know, I think it starts with being a part of the conversation, and conversations like we are having at this conference. You know, as Jennifer was saying, you know, I don't think any of us here are new to being global universities, right? We're very intentional, even today at BU, about how many international students we attract, how many first-generation students we attract as a way to drive more diversity, right? But I think we're at a new place. In fact, it was a colleague at, I think it was the woman from Coursera in an earlier session, who said something like, if you're not paying attention to India, you're not paying attention. And so she said it more eloquently than that. But I think this is a time, you know, we have to think about the global talent base. We have to think differently. We can't do it alone any longer. So the power of engagement, the power of collaboration. Like Jennifer, we also have a new president, very progressive leadership, talks a lot about excellence to eminence and how to scale through new partnerships. So I think this is the perfect opportunity to think differently and be bolder in our thinking about how we do that. So I really look forward to continuing the kinds of conversations that will help enable that.
I think the only thing I would add, because I agree with all of that, and I think UWA is doing that, we've invested heavily into India. We've got 10 full-time staff based here. We're looking to scale that up. We're looking to have physical footprints in India. It's a key market for us. If you turn left out of Western Australia, you're the first major country you hit. For us, it's the major market. So we've always looked to India. We're an anomaly in Australia in that India is second largest provider of international students. China is still number one in Western Australia. On the East Coast, India's already become number one. So it's clear to us this is where our future lies. So just keeping that engagement, not just in a transactional way. It's not about just selling courses. It's about the entire footprint of a university, research, partnerships, supporting upskilling of teaching staff. That whole mix needs to be there.
So oldest advice and strategy is build on your strengths. So sitting in Singapore, not surprisingly, we have a lot of world-class colleagues, academics who are Indian. And again, if you give them a path to get back in and have an impact, I think they'll jump. Also, it's one of our now biggest alumni groups coming out in the world. But the other thing to engage faculty is around research. So like when we're putting together some of our conversational learning platforms, we're building in a lot of A/B testing type stuff, partly because it's good practice on building your platform, but also as a research tool. And again, India is a place where you can get the volumes that you need to really study things. So we think, again, you've got to find something compelling to make your key asset, your faculty engage, but we're pretty confident that India will be a key part of our strategy and access.
I love to hear that. To build on that with faculty, and specifically as we think about the technology angle, Peter, talk a bit more about the tech that you would see most relevant to providing to Indian to faculty to advance that.
Well, again, I'm broadly super bullish on AI to take down part of the cost of delivery. So, and again, in terms of what we were talking about earlier, making it specific to the context, it's relatively fluid. Like you can work things out in some context, and you can suddenly, like in the stuff I'm doing, you got these role plays, you swap personas and you localize it. So I think we're going to find that you can go both global and localize. So I'm super excited about that. And India, if you're playing in that space, as people have talked about at this conference, India is hugely attractive because of the numbers and some of the challenge of making it work here.
What I think has been great about this conversation is that you have, again, leaders from 3 absolutely fantastic institutions who have really put the money where their mouth is, or mouth where their money is. There's money in mouths, and it's all happening together today. But what's most important is understanding, again, that this is a key issue that we face together. And for those who are from campuses in the audience, thinking about the things that were touched on here and the importance of partnerships, flexibility, the use of technology, all of these pieces come together to have a greater, broader global audience. And there is no downside to a highly educated global populace. And the more that all of us can do a good job of spreading that education and spreading that knowledge, the better place this world will be. Thank you all for joining this session, and enjoy the conference. Thank you, panelists.